Hi, and welcome to Danny After Dark. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a notification or a new episode. I have been off for a week, but I am back. So I'm looking forward to tonight's show and to do the book review that I have in store for you guys for tonight. I had read this book, several months ago, and I just put it to the back burner. And now I was like, all right, let's do this. Let's tackle David Koresh. So that's what we have in store. I will do a little bit of a disclaimer before we jump into the book. But before I do that, how are y'all doing? It is so good to be back, and let's see who's here. I already see who's the first one here causing trouble. James Watson, hello. You know, in the state of the world right now, nothing would surprise me. Nothing surprises me anymore. But good to see you. Hey, Capone, good to see you too. Chris James, Richard, how you doing, hun? Let's see, K-Dog, hello. Okay, so as people trickle in, I have some kind of pausing points, if you will, because there's a lot to tackle with this subject in this book. Hello, Doleg Beauty, welcome. So this book, if you haven't seen the thumbnail already, that I will be reviewing is Koresh, the true story of David Koresh and the tragedy at Waco. It is by Stephan Talty. So the disclaimer that I want to say is there are so many books out about David Koresh, and I realize that there's a lot of information out, and depending what author you read, there might be a different narrative to each. And with that being said, if you read it from law enforcement's perspective, they would have a totally different narrative of events compared to like a Branch Davidian survivor per se, or somebody like Stephan Talty, who is, was not involved in it, but then did research on it. So, and I'm not saying any one is right or wrong. It's just a matter of there are a lot of different ways to discuss this case, and not everybody would agree with everybody's assessment on it. So tonight's book review is not necessarily a breakdown of this is the way it happened, this is the right theory to put out. It's just a complete review of Stephan's research on it and why I recommend this book. So people in the chat, feel free to certainly talk about this case with each other, because again, there are a lot of different, I hate to say the word theories because that makes it sound so loose, but you know what I mean about this case. And yeah, we will kind of go from there. So I will read the back to you guys, but as you know, I typed it up in regards so I don't have to just necessarily stare at the back cover or the insert description of the book and look away from you guys. So the book, as described by Stephan Talty, is the first comprehensive account of David Koresh, his road to Waco, and the rise of government mistrust in America from a master of narrative nonfiction. No other event in the last 50 years is shrouded in myth like the 1993 siege of the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. Today, we remember this moment for the 76 people, including 20 children, who died in the fire, for its inspiration of the Oklahoma City bombing and for the wave of anti-government militarism that followed. What we understand far less is what motivated the Davidians' enigmatic leader, David Koresh. Drawing on first-time exclusive interviews with Koresh's family and survivors of the siege, best-selling author Stephan Talty paints a psychological portrait of the infamous icon of the 1990s. Born Vernon Howell into the hypermasculine world of Central Texas in the 1960s, Koresh experienced a childhood riven with abuse and isolation. He found a new version of himself in the halls of his local church, in love in the fundamentalist sect of the Branch Davidians. Later, with a new name and professed prophetic powers, Koresh ushered in a new era for the Davidians that prized his own sexual conquests as much as his followers' faith. As one survivor has said, quote, "What better way for a worthless child to feel worth than to become God," end quote. In his signature immersive storytelling, Talty reveals how Koresh's fixation on holy war, which would deliver the Davidians to their reward and confirm himself as Christ, collided with his paranoid obsession with firearms to destructive effect. Talty shows how the Davidians' deadly 51-day standoff with the embattled FBI and ATF embodied an anti-government ethic that continues to resonate today. Now, 30 years after that unforgettable moment, Koresh presents the tragedy at Waco and the government mistrust, and inspired in its fullest context yet. I just read a lot of information to y'all. So I will say that description that Stephen Talty does of this book is spot on. It covers everything in there, some a little bit more so than others. In regards to, and you'll see this as I go on and explaining my book review of this, I don't get a ton into the actual 51-day siege. Stephen Talty does an excellent job covering that. I will hit on a couple of points here and there, but for the most part, this is a basic narrative that everybody has been aware of. But if that's something where you really wanted to get into that information, I would suggest definitely picking up the book for yourself, because again, Stephen does an excellent job describing that. But for me personally, I really wanted, because y'all know psychology is my thing, I wanted that background information on David Koresh. Although again, that was a name that he took on later on. And that was a whole road that I really wanted to capture and get more information on when I first discovered this book, and it did not disappoint. So let's see. I just want to double check with you guys. Saw a few people come in. Hey, Steve. Let's see. Tony L. Good to see you. I don't know why I was about to say Steven. Tony L. Good to see you. Let's see. Chaos. Hello. K-Dog, Janet, Rena. Yes. K-Dog, I will mention that, because that is one of the things that is discussed in the book, because it gets into the political ramifications that happened because of this. James says, I saw the compound burning live on TV. This case was all over TV in the weeks leading up to the end. Yes, I was still a kid when this happened. So that was something, needless to say, that my parents didn't have on the TV for me to watch. I'm sure they had it on the TV and they were watching, but weren't having it on for me to watch, not so much. But with that being said, with things like YouTube now, you can go and find a lot of clips. So if that is something where people do want to see original news clips from that time, you can certainly find that on YouTube. And there is one that is out that does have an interview and there's a picture with Timothy McVeigh, which is very interesting, because we all know what happens, what he goes to go on to become. So let's see. Speaking of hypermasculine in Texas, where's Beckham? I don't. Oh, all right. As I scroll down, there he is. But it's like Beetlejuice, 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 James. You say Beckham so many times and he just shows up in the chat. Hey, Fiddle. So Fiddle remembers watching the standoff and the compound burn on the news as a kid. Really? Interesting. Interesting. Because you're not that much older than me, Fiddle. So that's interesting that, I mean, as I say that, your parents let you watch that. But again, you are a little bit older than me, so it would have been a little different. Or hell, you're a lot older than me. Just kidding. So Koresh was into a little helter-skelter himself. Oh, God. Let's see. Yeah, chaos. Yes, yes. Well, hello, Beckham. I lived this. Do you mean liked? Yeah, no kidding. Hey, Tony Stewart. Good to see you, hon. That whole situation could have... that's one of the things that the book does discuss. And I feel like that's discussed in every author's book, but from different angles, is how it could have been handled differently. Oh, dear God. Beckham was in her early high school. Really? I thought you were Beckham. Really? I thought you would have been in middle school. Oh, James Watson. I mean, I'm all for like shoot for the moon, but like in this case, like you're just like reaching up with your hands. I mean, aim higher. All right. So let's get into this. I'm really excited to talk about this book because again, I typically don't talk about, cults on my channel often. So in regards to doing a book review on one, I figured, yeah, it's kind of the best of both worlds. So this book is quite long, I will say. It is 446 pages. And you can kind of tell it's a pretty big book. It only with all of that has 8 pictures of photos, and they are a mix of black and white images. I personally kind of wish that the book had more photos, to be perfectly honest. That's just me. I think I would have wanted a little bit more. And the photos kind of go through, if you guys can see, like a mix of Vernon Howell as a child with his family, a little bit of Branch Davidian pictures, if you can see that. So some of the pictures, some of them are in color, but most of them are black and white. It does have, where's the one I wanted to show you guys? Yes. So this one has Timothy McVeigh up at the, sorry, it's at a weird angle here, up at the top, and then down at the bottom, the compound burning. So again, only 8 pages of photos. I personally would have liked more, but that is just me. Nonetheless, I mean, then again, this case is so well covered and there are images and videos everywhere online. So I understand not putting more in because there are a lot of images that everybody has seen, but nonetheless, okay. Just checking on to see where you guys are in the chat. So the book itself starts with Bonnie Clark. She is 9 months pregnant and only 14 years old, and she's about to have her baby. The baby's father was Bobby Wayne Howell. We learn about the relationship and Bonnie's relationship with her parents. When she had her baby, she named the child Vernon Wayne Howell. The book discusses how Vernon would be shuffled back and forth between his mother and each new husband that she had, and being shuffled back and forth with his grandparents as well. So there's really not much stability in his life as a young child. In each situation he was in, there was a lot of hostility. That included being physically abused, mentally abused, and Vernon never quite understood why, just being a child, but he would always try to please the adult in his life more and more. He seemed to get a lot more positive attention from females in his life versus adult males. Vernon was enrolled in the Seventh-day Adventist Sabbath school when he was about 4 or 5 years old, and he was excited to go to that. The SDA church was steeped in prophecy. It believed that one day the earth would be scraped clean with fire and the righteous would march with Jesus. It was all there in the book of Revelation. And Vernon had completely absorbed these teachings. Vernon was diagnosed with a language disability, which caused problems with his reading comprehension. He was unable to follow along in books or with writing. However, his memory was excellent. If he saw something once, he would be able to memorize it and remember how to do it after that first glance. Vernon was picked on in school because he was in the, and this is the language that is used in the book, quote unquote, retarded class, end quote. Again, that is not a term that would be used now, but at the time that was the language that was used. That is the language that the author uses. So I'm quoting that just to show that example. So meanwhile, Vernon was still absorbing religion during this time. He would watch preachers on TV and listen to radio sermons. The family also had a neighbor who was a Baptist minister, and Vernon would sometimes go to his church and listen to his sermons live. Vernon never really understood why the other kids in the pews hated being there, because when Vernon was there, he absolutely loved it. And again, he absorbed everything. Vernon had been sexually abused by one of his mother's relatives. Quote, I was 5 years old, a little innocent boy who didn't know anything, end quote. The touching got worse until the man raped him. It went on for 4 years. He refused to give the abuser's name. He felt it might get back to his mother and hurt her. Quote, it's terrible that people do that to little children, end quote. One night, Vernon was looking out his window and watching the sky. He saw a very beautiful soft explosion way, way out in the universe, and he heard a voice. It said one word, quote, Vernon, end quote. He got so excited that he jumped out of his bed and ran to his parents' bedroom. He told his mother what had just happened. His mom's response was, quote, go to sleep and it will go away, end quote. Vernon was confused. Why would he want this to go away? God spoke to him. The voice made Vernon feel special and good. God picked Vernon to speak out to millions and millions of people. At least that's how Vernon interpreted it. Vernon was convinced God chose him and that God spoke to him. Now, at 11 years old, Vernon began to work out, and he was now becoming lean, and he also formed a band with a few guys. While the guys in the band were focused on smoking weed and having sex with girls, Vernon was only interested in the music. He couldn't really, he couldn't grasp, he couldn't understand why the guys would be focusing on outside things like drugs, like girls, like sex, so on and so forth. On the religious end, Vernon felt God was showing him the falsity in people. He noticed this more and more. So he had cut junk food from his diet to live a more pure, kind of nutrition-based life. Okay, quick pause to see how you guys are in the chats. They're doing well. They're doing well. I know I took a week off. I mean, I had to. I literally couldn't do a show last week because it was my leading up to my dance performance, but they are all doing well. They are all doing good. Thank you for asking. So, in school, Vernon was a bit of a tough cookie in regards to Vernon would ask a question and the teacher would be unable to answer it and would just try to brush it off and kind of say, well, that's just a bunch of nonsense, if the teacher couldn't give a specific enough answer to Vernon. He thought this was absolutely rude, and he asked questions because he felt he needed to hear the truth. He couldn't understand, and he didn't like it when teachers patronized him with half-assed responses. So Vernon ended up dropping out of school after the 11th grade. At 17 years old, his grandfather didn't want him around anymore. Again, he was being shuffled still up into this time, back and forth, back and forth. So now at 17, Vernon had to navigate life on his own. And the book goes into detail in regards to all of the back and forth shuffling. I just kind of narrowed it down a little bit for you guys, but you can read a lot more of that, and specifically in regards to Vernon's grandfather's treatment of him. Again, Vernon got along a lot better with adult females than he did with adult males, and the book really goes to describe why that was the case. So before Vernon went off to navigate life on his own, he decided it was time to meet his biological dad, Bobby Howell. He didn't know anything about him. He had no memory of him. So Vernon was able to track him down. He drove to Houston and found a phone book in the city. He called every single person with the last name Howell in the directory. And after several people saying, no, you have the wrong household, someone actually knew his father and told Vernon where he could find him. So Vernon called ahead and then drove to his biological father's house. So the family had been told that Vernon would be coming, and they had arranged for all of Bobby's other children to be there to meet their long-lost half-brother. They met and realized all of the similarities that he had with his biological father. By the time Vernon pulled away in his truck, he was filled with a lot of joy and a sense of belonging. For him, it was a wonderful day. But that bond wasn't mutual. Vernon rarely saw his biological father after that ever again. Let's see. Hey, Auntie Mimi, good to see you. Welcome. The only Vernon I've ever known was a Pentecostal. So that's a different one, K-Dog. Imagine what could have been accomplished if guys didn't chase girls around. K-Dog, that goes both ways. It goes both ways. I will be honest and say that. All right, folks. So one night, Vernon went to the arcade with some friends. After a few hours, a girl he knew, Linda, was there. She came up and said hello. They spoke. Linda asked him to drive her home. Linda was 15. She didn't have her license yet. They started talking, and that led to kissing, and they had sex. They knew that the law was against them. Vernon thought that afterward, but it's just one of those times when a good man falls. At least that was his thought about it. And when I say kind of the law was against him, I'm talking about from a religious aspect. He felt that. He told himself it would never happen again. Well, the next day he went to Linda's to apologize. They started talking, and then they had sex again. Vernon now had a sense of jealousy and narcissism developing from this. He didn't just hate when a specific girl he liked slept with one of his friends. He hated when any girl slept with anyone who wasn't him. I found this personally, this kind of shift in Vernon's mentality, a real turning point in the book, because it just really goes on to show a lot of future thoughts that he had. Because again, he goes on from, what are these guys doing in my band? Girls, we don't want any of that, to now a huge sense of narcissism. But again, what we learned down the road, not surprised, but this was just an interesting point for me in the map of, okay, now here's where we start to turn in a different direction. Okay. So Linda had called Vernon to say she was pregnant. His response was, quote, "I'm sterile," end quote. So after a few weeks, Vernon thought about it, and he thought, you know what, I really can raise a child. And he didn't want to make the same type of mistakes that were made with him. So he went to the Bible and read the scriptures that spoke of sex and marriage. And in Vernon's mind, he realized that sleeping with Linda, well, it wasn't a sin at all. They'd lain with each other, which, as Vernon interpreted the scripture, made them a married couple in God's eyes. So if he could get Linda to be with him and to honor the marriage contract, then everything would be fine. Vernon was finding in the Bible what he wanted to find. And we will see that exact statement over and over and over again. The author, there'll be more examples than what I cover here in the review, but the author really goes through like each of those points in Vernon's life where he kind of takes what he wants from the Bible for his own personal gain. So Vernon drove to Linda's house, but on the way, he pulled over to a payphone to call. He wanted to give her the great news. Again, they were going to be married in the eyes of God. She just had to fulfill the contract on that end. So to him, he was, again, wanted to say they weren't sinners. They were newlyweds. Linda immediately told Vernon she had an abortion. Quote, "I had to," end quote. Vernon did go to Linda's house and ended up staying there. And when I say Linda's house, it was her father's home. So at Linda's father's house, the father had asked that Vernon respect his home and not have sexual relations with his daughter. Vernon agreed. However, within days, he realized that wasn't going to happen. He was in love with Linda and he couldn't control himself. So him and Linda were having sex every single opportunity that they could. Well, what do you think happened? Linda got pregnant again. Linda's father found out and he ordered Vernon to leave the house. Vernon would still go to see Linda against her father's rules. But something changed in regards to how Linda was viewing Vernon. Linda had said that Vernon was starting to scare her. He was becoming too obsessive. He was ranting. He was raving about what God wanted. So she suggested he actually go to see someone like a psychiatrist. Well, Vernon didn't let those suggestions bother him. He just kept going to Linda's house, telling her that God told him that she was to be his. By the way he saw it, if God ordained it, then it really wasn't Linda's decision to decide. So Linda now started to avoid Vernon. She was afraid for herself, but she was also afraid for the baby that she was carrying. Once the baby was born, she didn't even let Vernon see the baby, no matter how much he begged. Every time he tried, Linda's father would tell him just to go away. The thing is that Linda let Bonnie, Vernon's mother, come by, see the baby, hold the baby, so on and so forth, but not Vernon. So clearly that wasn't going to go over well. Vernon, meanwhile, loved, on the religious end, the book of Revelation. To him, it contained the code that unlocked the scriptures. All the books in the Bible began and met there. The book goes on, in regards to Stephen's book, it goes on to discuss in great detail how Vernon ended up meeting each and every underage girl that he would go on to later rape and marry. So I know we just kind of taken a big shift in the narrative, but now that I hate to say Linda's out of his life, because Vernon never really lets her completely go, and we'll get into that later. But we all see that Vernon's narcissistic kind of part of his brain has been fully activated, and he's going to have, whether it's against the girl's wishes, he's going to go on to have them, whether that means consensually or not consensually. And it was non-consensually. Age did not matter to Vernon. So whether she was of legal age to have sex or not, in most of the time, like a high percentage of the time, they were not of legal age. So the book shifts gears into that. Before I really go down that road, let's just double check where you guys are in the chat. Who's Vernon? Vernon Howell is David Koresh. David Koresh is Vernon Howell. Vernon Howell was who was born. David Koresh is the name that Vernon adopts later on, and we will get into that in the book. Beckham, you should know that. We've talked about this case before. And Beckham, you're from Texas. We have fully talked about this. He just doesn't listen. He just doesn't listen. All cult leaders seem to be sexual deviants. They, in one way or another, that is a huge part of the control aspect from every single cult leader that I have researched. You are spot on, K-Dog. Revelations again. It always goes back to Revelations in this book. So, all right. So again, disclaimer. So I know I kind of quickly threw it in there in regards to what we're going to be getting into Vernon now going on and raping and marrying underage girls. I'm not going to get into detail because that's just not cool. We're not going to discuss that here. The book does a well enough job, I'll put it that way, in describing a lot of the women or the girls that David would meet, how he would lure them, how he would win over the parents, or not even win over the parents, just kind of claim these girls as his and go on to rape and actually marry them. So if you want to get more information on that, because it happens a lot, Stephen Talty does a great job on talking about that in detail in this book. And it was really interesting to read about each of the situations, because at this point in the book, he's still Vernon Howell, and he really picks up, things along the way, where if there was a barrier in one situation, he kind of realized how he could avoid that in the next situation, or if something worked really well, kind of use that and strengthen it to his advantage in the next situation. And you really get to see all of that. I will give him credit for that. And I hate to give him credit for anything, but you do see how he does realize, okay, there was and he wouldn't even use the word mistake, but something that didn't go to his way in one situation, he would realize how to get around it in the next. So, and the book does an excellent job laying that out. So, in addition to that topic, the book also discusses how others around him, for example, the community, the family members of these girls would act. Most of them, as you can imagine, were completely against it. However, nobody actually, for the most part, stepped in to stop it. They saw it happening, but really didn't take the steps to stop it. As these marriages that God had told him to happen were happening, Vernon was traveling to more places. And that was actually one thing that I either had read a long time ago about this case and forgot, or I just completely didn't know, is not only was he traveling to different places within the United States, but actually traveling out of the country to expand on the Branch Davidians and his, his religion, because as we come to know, he was kind of, we'll get into that, how there was like a split in the Branch Davidians in regards to him. But that was one thing I didn't know, is that he went to other countries to try to recruit more and more people. Let's see, quick pause. Shelly says, well, hello, Danny. Well, hello, Shelly. Remember Timothy McVeigh. We will get into that, Tony. Let's see. Okay. So in 1981, David Koresh, Stephen Howell was led to, did I just say Stephen? Vernon Howell was led to Mount Carmel. Lois was in charge at the time of the Branch Davidians, and he ultimately worked his way into the community. Vernon spent most of his days studying, trying to master the extremely complex Branch Davidian theology. Among the Davidians, everything a prophet said, everything a follower believed, it had to be justified through scripture. You couldn't just say, quote, I believe this because I feel it in my heart, end quote. You had to back up your interpretation with chapter and verse and be prepared to defend it. And as we have learned about Vernon back from years prior, he was very good at reading through scripture and taking different parts and twisting them. I'm saying the word twist, twisting them to meet whatever personal gains he was looking to achieve at that time. So I can see how something like that, being able to be in a situation where you had to defend your interpretation through chapter, through verse, how he would be up for that challenge. So eventually he and Lois would get together, and they even announced that she was having his baby. Lois was 63 years old. So let's keep that in mind. So needless to say, nothing was happening, but Vernon was making that announcement. She was pregnant with his baby. Vernon, during this time, left Lois to be with a young minor girl. He would have sex with them, with each of these other young girls, and say they were now married because God told him. Lois found out, and she did not take to this well. The Branch Davidians thought the way it got twisted was Lois was the one handling this immaturely, not Vernon, but Lois. So meanwhile, there was another member, George Rodden. He was trying to gain the highest position in control of the Branch Davidians. But so was Vernon. So the book goes quite a bit into this kind of divide between Lois, Vernon, and George. There's a lot about that. I'll just give kind of a brief recap of it. So eventually, George was able to drive Vernon out of Mount Carmel. George was ultimately now the new leader of the Branch Davidians. Vernon was now eager to bring more believers into his camp because he just wasn't kicked out and thought, okay, I'll take my losses. No. So he decided to head to California and have some Davidians that left as well come with him to be next to his side. Followers who lived away from Mount Carmel were called, quote, outside, end quote, believers, and California was home to quite a few. So there were already Branch Davidians living out there. So Vernon, going to them, he was successful in getting people to join his camp. Vernon would travel all over. I already talked about that a little bit, and gaining new members along the way. Vernon was slowly gaining control of his followers. And the book does a really great job in describing how that transition happened, because it's not just with the Branch Davidians, but with a lot of other cults. If anybody is into researching cults like Jonestown, Heaven's Gate, so on and so forth, they, as much as some of them differ, there's a lot of similarities, and the control doesn't just happen overnight. There's, bits and pieces that happen along the way, where once you get to the end of the road, it's one of those, well, how did it go from A to Z so quickly? It doesn't always happen that way. In the book, at least in this case, does a great job in describing how the transition happened with each avenue of control. So in regard to the control that Vernon was gaining, it was his followers' faith, their diet, and their sex lives. In these matters, he was becoming the sole authority. He was beyond questioning. One of the areas that he did find hard to manipulate was who his people loved. Well, that didn't stop him. As the group grew, Vernon realized he couldn't keep cramming new recruits into the already packed houses that were in California. He had ordered new plywood shacks to be built in Palestine and sent some of the men there to get started. The shacks measured 8 feet by 12 for single people and 8 feet by 16 for couples and families. And there was no insulation in these, shacks that were being built. So it was quite hard to live there. If you wanted a window, you just simply cut a hole in the plywood and put some plexiglass there. So where he was, Bible studies went late into the night. In spare time, Vernon did not want you to do anything that would distract you from the message. No computers, no forbidden books, no fun, and definitely no extramarital marital sex. Well, as for Vernon, as you can imagine, he did whatever he wanted. If he wanted to sleep till noon, he slept till noon. But if you stayed up till 3 a.m. listening to him study, you still had to be awake when the bell rang for breakfast at 7 sharp. If you were late, you didn't eat. One of the members, named Mark, was once discussing surnames. Mark didn't really believe what he was saying, but he wanted to get people to relax. In regards to who Mark is and his role in all of this, the book goes really deeply into Mark and does an excellent job in doing so. I will just be touching upon it briefly in the interest of time. But I want to get to this last point. I'll keep an eye, see what you guys are saying in the chat. So what Mark says, quote, "It's not like the Bible said King Josias or something. See, Ben David can't be the true last name of the Messiah because it says clearly here the last name should be Cyrus. So if anything, the Messiah's name should be David Cyrus. And if you really want to get technical, Koresh, or something along those lines in how you pronounce Cyrus in Hebrew. So maybe we should call the Messiah David Koresh." Mark, when he said this, again, he just kind of made it up to get people to relax. He expected the entire group that heard him to break out in laughter, but no one did. They were all smiling. And out of that, that is how the name David Koresh came to be. All right, let's see where you guys are in the chat. Yeah, Beckham, absolutely. Absolutely. That's definitely what it was not called then, but that's exactly what you're describing. Let's see. He sounds like a very intelligent individual. A lot of things that I will say he knows how to, he's very, what's the word I'm looking for? Personable, very convincing, very charismatic. So he's able to draw in people, and he does so, or he did so very well. And you see that not again with a lot of cults. There's a lot of similarities between the leaders of cults. Those who are in it would never call it that. They would never call it a cult, but nonetheless, outsider looking in, that's exactly what it is. But yeah, to have that kind of photographic memory where you could see something once and repeat it, that's a skill. Not everybody has that, as Beckham pointed out. So let's see. Made him look like a god, being able to memorize the Bible. That photographic memory, Beckham definitely worked to his advantage, because again, with the Branch Davidians, if you were going to, try to argue a point, you had to defend it. You had to be able to cite things. And with the type of memory that he had, that made it that much easier for him to do so. So that's an excellent point. I wouldn't go on to compliment Beckham that far, but you know what, K-Dog, to each their own, to each their own. We're not getting it. You guys can talk about that in the chat. I will not. This is a book review. This is not my thoughts on the case. Y'all can talk about that in the chat, because again, depending on what author you read, you're going to get totally different answers. You could read 10 different books, and not only would it be split on which side, if you will, fired first, but who in each side, where in each, there's a lot. There's a lot. Frank Vargo. Hello, Frank. Beware of cults like the Branch Davidians, because they interpret scripture the way they see it. Yeah, again, that's an excellent point, Frank. But it's, again, we see that with a lot of, like you said, other cults, because if you're going to have it serve your own personal gain and personal means, you have to be able to twist things sometimes. So yeah, which means interpreting things to suit your needs. Okay. Hello, good to see you. Camp Elasticity Productions. Hope you're doing well. Swamp Fox's Strange Corner. Hello, welcome. Cult of Personality. Let's see. I can relate to that. I was a very good reader as a child. Being a good reader at any age is absolutely awesome, I will say. But then again, I'm a self-proclaimed book nerd. So, but that is awesome, especially as a kid, because not every kid likes to sit in and read. So that's awesome. K-Dog, Jim Jones was reading Beyond His Years as a child. Yes. I have mentioned that book in so many other cases that that book pops its way into a lot of true crime cases. It's kind of interesting when I'm doing research and I'm like, oh, that book's coming up again. Hey, Renee, you are not late. You are fashionably on time. Good to see you. All right, so a few more pages of notes. I'm just going to briefly get into the next point where we just covered was how the name David Koresh came to be. So in the winter of 1987, Mount Carmel was increasingly on Vernon's mind. It was the home of the Branch Davidians, and he wanted to retake it as his own. This meant that his movement had to gain greater legitimacy among the worldwide faithful, and most likely it would then increase flow of funds. He wanted his believers there, but to make that happen, he had to take it back. So there was a lot of back and forth between Vernon and George involving law enforcement. Vernon and his followers were ultimately charged with attempted murder of George. Again, it was one of those details where I'm like, did I read that a long time ago and forgot, or am I just reading this now? Like, there's just some details where I just could not place it. And when you hear this, you're like, okay, so David Koresh at this point in time, he's in jail. Like, that's great, but doesn't stay. So although Vernon and his followers were charged with attempted murder of George, that doesn't mean he was going to stay in jail. So at this point in the book is where Lois dies of cancer. So she has now passed away. So Mount Carmel was now being ruled by David Koresh. The book goes a lot more into this. I like my 4-ish sentences about this, I could have probably done a whole show just on this kind of taking over between Vernon, George, and Lois. Stephen does an excellent job discussing that in the book. If that's something you're kind of more interested in, spot on. I just kind of wanted to give the little bit of information so you kind of see how that transition happened. So David now is in charge of the Branch Davidians and running it. So with that comes, he had plenty of money coming in, as much as $500,000 a year. And think about that. That's a lot of money now. Think how much money it was back then. I did not do the kind of translation of what that would have been at that time, but tons of money, tons and tons of money. So the Branch Davidians had jobs that they had to do that would contribute 30% of their income. We see this with other cults where they contribute a little bit. But over time, the amount that they contribute becomes more and more. And it got to the point where those who were working outside jobs were contributing 100% of their income to David. David assigned the Davidians to do guard duty at the front gate. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. They were armed with rifles, AK-47s, and other weapons. Everyone was required to do their shifts, including pregnant women. So in regards to the children that lived at the compound, so parents were not allowed to give their own children gifts. Gifts would come from David only. He also had it where no one's body belonged to their own self. It only belonged to David. There was no room for anyone to undermine anything that David Koresh, the prophet, authorized. David wanted recruitment efforts to go international. As I mentioned, so he and other members traveled not just within the United States, but to other countries to try to gain new members. And each of the times that he did travel, there were people that him and his followers would kind of pick up to join him at the compound, Mount Carmel. The book goes into that, the travels, who went with him, kind of how that played out and how they were able to gain more members. I'm just kind of giving the blanket overview that he was traveling and then gaining more members that way. So the abuse of the adult followers at first was mostly verbal. The children, however, at Mount Carmel had it the hardest. They were spanked, and when they were, it was often very violently. Vernon demanded respect, again, not just from the adult individuals living there, but also the children. Followers who had contacts with outside relatives, well, that had to stop. That had to come to a complete stop. Even people who were living at Mount Carmel were not even allowed to have pictures of their families. So he wanted to be the only object of love and devotion to everybody who lived at Mount Carmel. For David, however, this was still not enough. He had to have complete psychological control over all of his followers, adults and children. None of the believers' marriages had been sanctioned by God, meaning David then would say all women belong to him. The prophecy was always only about David himself, not about any of his followers. The book goes into detail about Mark. Again, we talked about Mark a little bit earlier on. He's the one that gave, it was a joke, the name David Koresh, but ultimately that stuck. So Mark was one of the Branch Davidians who ended up leaving to go to Australia, and he actually went to campaign against David. This part of the book I found very, very interesting. So that is worth it, I think, a read in itself, but I'll just kind of leave it at that. So yeah, Mark has had enough and he's campaigning against him. So meanwhile, guns were flowing into the compound at a high rate. Training on them was becoming mandatory. Even children were loading magazines into rifles. The followers learned how to strip down an AK-47 and then had to reassemble it. Group members converted rifles from semi-auto to automatic by cutting out the safe switch and other modifications. So we talk about an example of how David was working with the father of one of the 13-year-old girls on the compound. And David had raped and married the 13-year-old girl. Well, the father ended up, thank God, taking this to court. The father was awarded full custody of his daughter back. However, and with that being said, in regard to David, there was to be no contact with the girl at all. This was a huge defeat for David because the secrets of Mount Carmel were now being made a bit public. They were now being aired, and a judge had to endorse this. However, the FBI and local sheriff's department at this time, according to Stephen Talty, took no notice of the proceedings. So in regards to this one incident, I kind of think this was the first time that an adult kind of saw what was happening to his child and heard what was happening, was like, no, this ain't happening, and actually went to court over it. And again, David Koresh did not take that very well. And this is what kind of started to get what was happening into the public light. Before I continue, let's see, 1.2 million. Thanks for that conversion, James. Swamp Fox, A Strange Corner. It's a lot like Scientology. I can see that. Yeah, a lot of similarities. I will agree with you on that. So K-Dog is saying these cult leaders get what they want from their followers, then carry it to their destruction. Well said. Well said. Tony with the math. Let's see. Approximately US dollars, 1,100,000. Yeah. Or 2.24 times 1992 purchase power. Okay, Tony, I will say James Watson's answer was a little more confined, but thank you for laying that out. But yeah, you guys are both right in there with the same figure. So thank you for doing that conversion. Like, that's insane. That is such a large amount of money because like, taking a step back, you think, okay, well, there's how many people on the compound, how many adults, how many children. We all know good and damn well David Koresh he was taking that money. He was not then sharing it with the people living at Mount Carmel. That was not happening. So, yeah. But thank you both for getting that breakdown. So the book discussed some of the local media interviews that David did with them. And it was clear when these interviews were happening that David was becoming a lot more mentally unstable by this point. And of course, one could argue the psychology of David Koresh, saying, was he ever mentally stable? At what point kind of did the real shift happen? That's neither here nor there. That can be a whole conversation in itself. It's not necessarily described in depth in this book. We just kind of go from, okay, now what's happening at the compound is being made public, and David thinking in his mind it would be a great idea to do interviews with the local media kind of backfired because it was clear again in these interviews that he was not mentally stable at this point. So the reporters who were with him doing the interviews, they didn't even feel safe there either. And I think that's very telling. There was an investigation going on about the children at Mount Carmel. However, it was dropped because there was no evidence of sexual abuse on the children. And none of the Branch Davidian members agreed to testify against David. I will say I understand the Branch Davidians not wanting to testify against him. They are so wrapped into what he they've given up everything. They've given everything. They might not even realize they're under so much control, financially, emotionally, their own, sexually, everything, income wise, everything. But in regards to the young children that he was raping and marrying and who were getting pregnant, young kids are getting pregnant. I don't know how that wasn't picked up. I don't know. I don't know. So the book goes into a lot of examples where law enforcement tried to get involved, but there wasn't enough to do anything. This is from Stephen Talty's perspective and his research about that. Again, like I said earlier, that you could read different books on the subject and see kind of different angles of how that's played out. I'm not saying any of them are right or any of them are wrong, but in this book, particularly from author Stephen Talty, he gives the examples of where law enforcement did try to make the effort to get involved, but it just wasn't happening because there wasn't anything they could do at that time. There was also examples where law enforcement were given information but didn't do anything, where there seems like enough evidence would have allowed that. So I will say that as well. Eventually, law enforcement did get their eyes on David, and surveillance on Mount Carmel had increased. The book discusses the ATF's involvement with Mount Carmel at this point. The training began at Fort Hood, about an hour from Waco. So pause in the book review at this point. I did a book review, maybe a year ago at this point. I can't keep track of time. But it was James McGee's book, Phase Line Green. And that was about, he was in the ATF, and the book focused mainly on the Talladega incident, but it does touch a little bit on Waco and Ruby Ridge because he himself was with the ATF at the time of all of these. So if you kind of want to get a little bit more information on the ATF, go back to my review of Jim McGee's book, Phase Line Green. I did a whole review on that book. That is an excellent book. It'll at least give you a little bit more of an idea on the ATF. So now that we've addressed that part, the book from Stephen Talty, going back simply to David Koresh, does describe in detail about the ATF attack on the compound. I'm just going to give like 2 sentences about this because, again, we've all kind of read and heard about the 51-day hostage that was Waco. It started on February 28th, 1993 and went till April 19th, 1993. And the book itself, in regards to this whole 51-day hostage situation, takes about 150 pages of the book. It takes up a good chunk. Well worth the read. I, again, just didn't feel it necessary to kind of rehash a lot of that information that we already know a lot about. But again, Stephen Talty, excellent job in breaking down what happened those 51 days. The book, as some of you guys have been talking about in the chat, does reference Timothy McVeigh. And in regards to referencing him, it mentions how he watched what was happening on live TV, as so many other people did. As several of you guys in the chat said you were watching it live when this happened. And that Timothy ended up driving down to the area to be there in person. Again, at the beginning of the book, there's 8 pages of pictures in here, and one of them is of Timothy McVeigh there. So that is in the book as well. But it's just a very, very brief explanation of Timothy McVeigh being there and kind of setting up what we know would come later on. But of course, that was not known at the time. So one of you guys, I'm blanking who, let me scroll back up because I want to give credit where credit is due here. All right, K-Dog mentioned it. Janet Reno was Attorney General. So the book gets into after the 51 days, the politics play a huge part in the aftermath. So President Clinton was in charge, and of course, Janet Reno. And we hear a lot about that dynamic. There are several quotes from Janet Reno's press conference where she says, quote, "I approve the plan. I am responsible for it. The buck stops with me," end quote. So I personally, in regards to like the politics of it all, that really wasn't of huge interest to me in reading this. Again, I was really wanting to know more about kind of the psychological background of David Koresh, Vernon Howell, and kind of leading up and then kind of following his psychological journey as everything happens. That was kind of what I was looking for in this, reading about the politics that happened in the aftermath. That was great information to learn. I wasn't gravitated to that. But somebody who is into politics and about how this particular moment in history impacted that, you would absolutely love that section of the book. So keep that in mind. So autopsies were done on the Branch Davidian members who lost their lives. 76 died in the compound. Again, at least 20 were children under the age of 14. 20 of the bodies had received gunshot wounds, including at least 5 children. Some of the children had been injured by shrapnel from grenades that had been launched, and there were a lot of dead members inside the bunker. One individual was stabbed to death. Most of the others had died from the carbon monoxide. Others had died from thermal burns due to the fire or suffocation when they were buried under the rubble of the collapsing building. And David Koresh, disclaimer for those who don't know, had been shot in the center of his forehead. In regards to who shot him, again, depending on who you read, there's a lot of who could have done that. Stephan does talk about that in his end. And if you're wondering, well, who did he say? No. Get the book and read it. Get the book and read it. So at the end of the book, it discusses the numerous hearings and studies of the Waco siege and the events that led up to it. And it reviews the reports and findings that emerged from that. So I just did a lot of throwing of information at you guys. So that is kind of the gist of the book in regards to my review of it. Do I recommend it? Absolutely. What I found that I really liked about it was very comprehensive. Again, it really went into detail on Vernon Howell's upbringing, how he took over the Branch Davidians in regards to the kind of power struggles that ensued between him, Lois, and George. And then, Mark, who was part of the Davidians, but then ultimately left to, inform others and basically just really try to just destroy Vernon's, reputation and just spread a lot of truthfulness, to be perfectly honest. But not everybody wanted to hear what was happening. But we don't see that very often where people were leaving Vernon and then going out and kind of doing a smear campaign, a hate campaign, if you will. But we do see that with Mark. I found that very interesting. The siege, again, it's about 150 pages in the book, the 51 days at Waco. The author does an excellent job in doing that. So, even if somebody wanted to get the book to kind of read about that, great. I personally found everything leading up to it really the meat of what I wanted. But again, reading about the siege was interesting. The politics that came out of this in the aftermath. Again, that wasn't kind of what I was going into it looking for, but I found it very, very interesting kind of what agencies and who within those agencies were either being blamed for what happened or taking the fall for what happened. So I know with Janet Reno there, again, depending on kind of what narrative you read, it could be that she had to take the fall for this, but then there could be, I've read where there were some words, she stood up to like, these were my decisions. These are, the calls that I made, the buck stops with me, so on and so forth. But I found that whole political aspect interesting as I was reading it. The aftermath. There is still a compound. There are still Branch Davidian members to this day. So the book doesn't get really into that, but I found it very interesting reading about the aftermath of what happened, in the back of my head, knowing there is still a compound. Obviously not where the original site was, but there is still a compound. I use that word loosely, but there's also surviving Branch Davidian members. So kind of reading this in the back of my head, I was thinking, I kind of wonder what they would have to say about this. Not just this author, but any of the books written. But yeah, that was kind of my big takeaway from this. But with that being said, let's double check where you guys are in the chat. And if any of you guys have any questions or comments on this book, by all means, let me know. I do highly recommend it. Let's see. What were the feds charging him with? Are you referring to David? Back when politicians would take blame. I mean, James, that did stick with me. I'm not going to lie. That was very interesting. It was a very quick, she didn't just take accountability, Janet Reno. She took full accountability publicly. You're right. That we would never see that now. Never. So you are absolutely right. Oh, you're funny. Okay. There were times he was off site. They could have got him. Something nefarious was going on. So, K-Dog, that's an excellent point that you make. The book, it very, very quickly describes that discrepancy. How sometimes he was off site, and then from the Branch Davidians and his narrative, Vernon's no longer alive, but their narrative of, yes, he would go out all the time. And then the law enforcement saying, no, he never went off site. So it's briefly mentioned in this book. I have read other books about this and seen, there's so many documentaries on Waco, but I have seen and heard about that in other sources as well. And it's the same narrative, where the Davidians were saying, and even community members who were not part of the Branch Davidian compound would say, yes, he went out, he went here, he went there. It was no secret when he was out. But then law enforcement saying, well, he never left. We couldn't do anything because he never left. But you're absolutely, where's the truth? I don't know. But that was something that stuck with me too. So thank you for mentioning that, K-Dog. Okay, so, all right. So just winding things down now. Again, if anybody has any questions or comments on this, especially if you are not watching it live and you are watching it on replay, please leave a comment and I will definitely get back to you. And if there's a question that I can answer, I will definitely answer that for you. Otherwise, it might be a yes, that was discussed in this book, or no, that wasn't, so on and so forth. Because again, this book is a big book. There are over 400 pages, so there's a lot to it. So I just kind of wanted to give you guys a bit of it in a nutshell about this book and why I recommend it. So. All right. So in regards to an episode later on this week, for the weekly True Crime and Chill, I'm still kind of figuring out what date would work. Not sure. If worst comes to worst and I cannot do it this weekend, it might be at the very, very end. We will have to see. I know I can't do that on Friday, but I have not done it in over a week, and I'm really wanting to get into talking with you guys about what's been going on. So I'm just trying to figure out plans on that. So I will let you guys know. I will post on Instagram, Danny After Dark, or the Facebook page for the show when the True Crime and Chill will be. So definitely make sure to follow those if you are not. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode and for this book review. I've been wanting to review this book for quite a while, and I finally grabbed it from the big stack of books that I need to review for you guys. I'm like, all right, let's just do this. So thank you again for joining, and I will see you guys later on in the week. Date to be determined. And remember, everybody, until next time, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us. Bye, everyone.